Good evening. Welcome to tonight's MACRI talk. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida-Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. With us tonight is Dr. Lydia Otero, who will be sharing about their memoir, In the Shadows of the Freeway, Growing Up Brown and Queer. Before we start, we have a brief message from our sponsor, AARP, an organization that believes in livable cities.
AARP is working to make communities more livable for people of all ages. But what is a livable community? In a livable community, people of all ages can find housing that is comfortable and affordable. It is also a community where residents can get where they want and need to go, regardless of whether they own a car. It's a place where people can spend time in parks and public spaces that are vibrant, safe, and healthy, so they can socialize with their friends and participate in fun activities. A livable community ensures access to needed shopping and healthcare services. It's a place where people can work or volunteer and be included in community events and decision-making. So, what is a livable community? It's one where everyone can make their city, town, or neighborhood a lifelong home.
We have a little commentary. Thank you, AARP, for sponsoring tonight's talk. As I mentioned tonight, we are joined by Dr. Lydia Otero, author of the memoir In the Shadows of the Freeway, Growing Up Brown and Queer. Being born and raised in Tucson, with deep family roots on both sides of the Arizona-Sonora border, inspired Lydia Otero's interest in regional history. In 2011, Otero received their first book award from the Border Regional Library Association for La Calle, Spatial Conflicts and Urban Renewal in a Southwest City. And in 2019, Arizona's Cesar y Chavez Holiday Coalition awarded Otero the Dolores Huerta Legacy Award for their activism and scholarship focusing on bringing awareness to Mexican American and Arizona history. The author has a PhD in history and was a tenured professor in the Department of Mexican American Studies at the University of Arizona. For more information about their work, please visit lydiaotero.com. Welcome, Dr. Otero. So good to see you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm excited to be talking to an entirely different audience through the MACRI and telling them about this memoir and why memoirs might be an avenue to garnering more insight, more into the past. And so I want to go through a bunch of slides and show folks some photographs of that period of my childhood. And so you're going to be the person that directs the slides, and I'll say next, right?
Yes.
Again, thanks to the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute for this talk and for AARP for sponsoring it. This is the cover that's today. As Sarah said, go look me up if you want to find me. I'm on the internet. I have my own website, and you'll learn more about me and my work and what's coming up. Next. So this is the cover of my book. I was born in 1955. Who would have thought that this photograph would have been a book cover? You can see the date on it. My sister took it, and it was taken when I was around 3 years old. The interesting aspect is that I had to ask my sister for a permission to publish the photograph, and she signed it, and she said, "What am I signing? This is your photograph." And I'm like, "Yeah, but we have to authorize me to use this photograph in a book." And she was very bewildered, but that's part of a memoir. And how you take care of these artifacts is also part of the story, right? obviously we didn't take care, or I didn't take care of something as precious as this photograph that would become the cover of my book. I like this photograph too because it's one of the few photographs that show me wearing pants. Next. So this memoir is focused on myself, right? One person, a person in one family, one house in the city of Tucson that lived in this barrio. So it gives you some insight into this history that perhaps you wouldn't get any other way. Through this personal story of mine, you learn about global relationships, you learn about the Interstate Highway Act, about President Kennedy, about racial relations and ethnic relations, about organizing, about Chicano pride, and certainly about segregation and about education. So all of these big themes are packed into this, into my memoir. The circle is the house that I was brought up and raised. We sold that house after my mother passed away, so I no longer own it. But this is how the street looks now. But as a child, it was teeming with life and people, and that's what I write about it in the book. Next. This gives you the proximity. It's like a long block away. See the two strips in the middle? It's a long block away from the freeway. So the freeway was a reality, a constant reality that we had to deal with and live around. And here, I mean, there was never a time or a place where you could ignore the freeway. If you've ever, you're just driving down the freeway, you know about the environmental hazards involved with the freeway, and just the focus on noise mostly, but also to some of the other things that involved us as a family living in that house close to the freeway. Next. So this is the house that I'm talking about. My mother and her sisters built the living room, the big area, while my father was at World War II. They made the bricks in the backyard, and the house is still standing. The room that they built, which was the big room, as I said, still stands. It looks very strong. You can get on the photograph to my left, you can see more of the adobe before it was stuccoed. And this photograph with some of my cousins is taken about 1950. You can see the thing that looks similar and that says, yes, it's the same house, is the mesquite in the back. You could see the little arm to it. Next. And so the freeway, big factor. I don't want you to read these newspaper articles, but I just want to tell you that in 1938, building a freeway through Tucson, at that time, it was a highway, was considered the price was too excessive, and the city didn't want to deal with it, didn't want to do it. By 1949, national attitudes and funding is made available for a freeway, and now it's a certainty. So that just tells you, I wanted to show you two newspaper clippings of how funding determines a lot of what is built in cities throughout the United States. Also to point out that we often think as the monumental legislation involved with the 1956 National Highways Act passed during the Eisenhower years. But to remind you that there was already this type of construction that involved displacement even before 1956, and it happened pretty much after World War II. And this example of what happened in my barrio is one of those really important ones. Yeah, next one. So in 1948, as I was looking through the newspaper, I found resistance to building this highway. And I'll just read it to you, okay? Because it says, we have homes in the path of the proposed freeway. And we hereby plead with you all, voters of Tucson, not to deprive us of our homes. You will realize that we cannot move or buy a place and live anywhere for the amount we will receive for our homes. And this is really exciting for me as a historian to have encountered this. It was a full-page newspaper article in the local paper. Next. Next. And so it looked like this. Well, it looked like this, and you can see that you can't really read the names. And if I would have reprinted that, you wouldn't have been able to see all the people who signed this plea to the voters of Tucson to vote against the freeway. And so I took that and I used phone books. Next. To come up with something that was more readable, more tangible, and to confirm the addresses. And for me, seeing these names and making sure these names are inscribed in history in a book somewhere is really important. And I've met people who have read the book and said, oh, my Tio lived there. And it's just a chronicling of history that it took me like 2 months to do this. I know it may not look like a lot, but going back and confirming them in phone books and doing the next thing took a long time. The next, Sarah. So I took every address and I turned them into a dot. So you can see which homes were destroyed to make room for the freeway. And they're all located on my street on Farmington. And if you can see at the bottom, there's 3 dots with little white circles in them, 3 at the bottom. And those are the only homes that still remain standing in 2019 when I published the book. So all those other houses were removed. And one of those houses that survived, of course, is my former house on Farmington that I showed you a picture of. Next. And this is the freeway when it was around 1958 when it was built. There's a lot to tell. It's hard to see from this vantage point, but you can see my house indicated there. When they built this highway through this area, not only did they divide the neighborhood from, make it hard for us on the west side of the neighborhood, separated us from grocery stores and from the downtown area, but they also didn't build any crossings. So to cross the freeway meant my family had to scurry across. It's hard to believe there were no underpasses, there were no overpasses. They built this freeway through a brown neighborhood and just left it to us to navigate and live, make peace, and structure our lives around this new highway. My sisters tell me, my older sisters tell me that they got accustomed to crossing the highway and just looking out for themselves. And in the much later, next one. You can see that Luis Robles, who was my grandfather, who lived with us, who was my caretaker, was coming back from the store, and he was one of the casualties that was killed as he was crossing to come back. Can't really read this. It says that he was run over multiple times, and they were looking for a truck responsible for running him over the first time. What I try to write about my book is the intergenerational trauma that occurred by living near the freeway. Is that, as you could see from previous photographs, when my sister heard the noise, she ran out there to see what happened. And this is the same sister that took the photograph of me for the cover. And she's still around. She's 83, and we're very close. And she's the one that told me this story of how she ran out there because she heard the screeching and the sounds. And she saw my Pa Luis's mangled body. So that's heavy, right? That's deep. In fact, I was very careful even when I asked her about this time. So what she does instinctively is she runs back home. She tells my mother that our grandfather, Pa Luis, was in an accident, and my mother runs over there and goes to see what's happened. And so the entire neighborhood knew what happened and witnessed that, which was very, it's violence, right? It's and this book, in terms of a memoir, is very important because, you know, I hope that my Pa Luis's death is not just like forgotten, and it's seen as a tragedy and a casualty of those communities that were one displaced, and also that survived the building of these various systems of transportation. Next. And this is my Pa Luis and my grandmita when they got married, and this would be like 1880. I want to read you something about my Pa Luis from the book, and let me find it. So just to put a story, I don't want to just be, I just don't want to tell you about his death. I want to tell you about a person. So my mother's father, Luis Robles, was born in 1887 at Fort Lowell, when it was an active U.S. military post. Geronimo had been captured the previous year. Located on the outskirts of Tucson, the post played an instrumental role in what is referred to as the, quote, Indian Wars. Luis was 4 years old when Fort Lowell ceased military operations. As an adult, he did not talk much about his parents except to say that they were Apache. He died when I was young, so I never got to ask him why he didn't share as much about his parents. I often wondered if Luis's father served as an Apache scout during the Indian Wars, but then again, his parents could have been part of the Apaches known as Mansos, who cleaned and cooked for the troops. Mansos incorporated Mexican culture into their daily practices, and Spanish became their primary language. Clearly, a cultural shift occurred sometime in Luis's life, and he began to identify as a Mexican. In a time of pervasive animosity directed at Apaches, especially in southern Arizona, he most likely wanted to distance himself from the Apache label in order to squeak by and gain employment. The outside world came to consider Luis to be Mexican, but the people close to him knew about his Apache background, and somewhere along the line, he acquired El Indio as a nickname. Next. And this is my grandmita. I want to read you a section about my grandmita. When the book came out, an academic friend of mine said to me, "You're so lucky that you can write about your grandmita." And I am. At the same time, I felt sorry for them that they couldn't. Also, here's this real basic observation. My grandmita was 86 years old when she passed away, and she did not speak English. She never spoke English. She didn't have to. So just her lifetime, in her lifetime and her life, testifies to the fact that, to the cultural networks and cultural ambience in Tucson, that a person like my grandmita didn't have to learn English to survive and live in Tucson. That's huge. So my grandmita came from, I'm reading for the book now, my grandmita came from a time that predated television, when people entertained themselves by memorizing and by learning engaging skills. She sang older songs at parties and also crooned soft lullabies to me when she put me to bed. At night, with the help of a lamp, she used her skillful hands to make shadow puppets of different animals. She knew how to make intricate shapes, forming ears and tongues that seemed to move separately from the animals' heads. When she played the card game Malia with her daughters, She shuffled the deck of cards in cascading waterfalls that made ruffling and snapping sounds. What world informed my gramita's special skills, I wondered. Did she hang out in cantinas playing poker? Curious, I would ask where she was from, and she would smile and say, de los seris, but rarely talked about it. She would deflect questions by taking my hand and pressing the center of my palm with her finger and say, I come from this place in Spanish. Next. And these are my mother's sisters. The two in the lighter colors, they'll move to Los Angeles. They're in my subsequent memoir because I'll move to Los Angeles and I'll move in with my tia Minty, who's in the center. I guess at this time, I would just want to read you a little bit about my mother here. Look at the time, keep track of it, and say that my mother, the experience of my mother, Cruz Chita Robles, who is the woman in black in the middle. She was born in La Calle, what I call the Tuzonense downtown. Mirrors the life of most working class brown women in the earlier part of the 20th century. She was 16 in 1929 when the stock market crashed, signaling the start of the Great Depression. Chita was the oldest girl in a family of 10 children. 3 of her siblings were born in the 1930s. Her family's economic setbacks had been in motion before the Depression took hold of the nation, and her father, Luis Robles, increasingly found himself out of work. Thus, economic necessity required that Chita forfeit her education and work for wages. The Depression encouraged a family economy where all members jointly contributed to the family's survival. During the 1930s, my mother's younger sister, Lydia, also left school in order to contribute to the family economy. Job opportunities were limited. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, brown women were concentrated in 2 principal areas of employment: domestic service and agricultural-related work. So like many other women throughout the Southwest with limited career choices, Chita and Lydia became domestics. Both sisters are listed in the early 1930s Tucson directories as maid living on Meyer Street in the barrio. My mother's in the center, and to my right of her is my tia Lydia. Next. This is a wanted. I hope you can read it. I'll try to read it. It says, women wanted for laundry work, Mexican or colored, experience not necessary, necessary. Oh, it says Tucson laundry and dry cleaners. So this is a typical of the type of employment that my mother and her sisters would encounter. That's why my two sisters her two sisters that went to LA, they got jobs. They moved to LA maybe around 1960, and they got jobs at the chicken processing plant. That's before they got mechanicalized, before they became mechanical projects. And so they worked very hard. It was horrible work. But I remember my tia saying, yeah, but it's better than, it pays more and it's better than we would have gotten back home in Tucson. And I think that sometimes as a historian, when there was an article by a Chicano historian that says, oh yeah, there was less discrimination, and made this announcement that there was less discrimination in Tucson than there was in LA, because Tucson had the Alianza Hispano-Americana and had more mutualista societies. And I now question those assessments, because maybe places where the racism was more virulent needed those. So I don't think that I think we have to reassess what it meant to have these social organizations in a city. Were they responding to something, or they just didn't create themselves because everything was nice and good? They created themselves and established themselves in response to something. Next. And I guess the hidden history. Black Lives Matter changed everything. Changed everything in terms of my psyche, in terms of the way I think of history. These hidden histories, makes it sound like there was no intention to them, but there was. They were manipulated and either erased or intentionally put, not acknowledged, not documented. And so the meme that came out around that time, and it applies to everything, right, is the system is not broken. It was designed that way. I think about that often when it comes to history, like who gets to be in the history books and what stories get to be told. I'm even thinking about that as it relates to memoir. I think that oral history is important. I engaged in that, and I don't want to at all knock it in any way. But I'm 68 years old, and I don't know. I want to start a new emphasis, and I want to tell people my age and older to consider writing a memoir. The technology is there. It's unlike what was in place 10 years ago. And so, we need people's perspective from the inside. And I hope that more people my age and will think about that. And I know that some of you all are out there have thought about it, and it's not that hard to do now. You don't have to go through a major publishing company. You don't have to go through an academic press. Just write it. I mean, if you're expecting to get a PEN Award or to be on the New York Times list of books, then that won't work for you. But if you just want to leave your story and tell it the way you want to tell it, and write about the things that you want to write about, then consider writing a memoir. Next. My mother was the archivist in the family. She saved everything. The reason I have all these documents is because my mother saved them. So she worked as a maid. She worked at the Holiday Inn near our house. And this is her pay stub. So you can tell that in 1960, she made $1 an hour, which I think is very important, a very important document. Next. She was also during World War II's part of that whole confluence of Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest who were trying to display and engage their patriotism. And this is a group that Chris Marin has wrote about. This is the only photograph of that group that I know of. And you can tell because they're holding little cans that they're raising funds for war bonds. And this certificate is in bad shape, but the photograph isn't. But I feel very lucky to have it. My mother is on my right. She's wearing a blazer. My aunt is on the extreme left. That's my tia Cristina, who I'll move in with when I moved to LA. And I also have another tia that's in the center, my tia Mage. So it was her sisters and the barrio women who formed this group. Also, their partners are off fighting a war, right? And but there's also a lot of violence directed toward Mexican American youth here in Tucson. At the time that this photograph is taken, there's the Pachucos, which were really present here in Tucson, were being targeted, were being arrested for vagrancy, and thus the institutionalized regulations around curfews. They were, because of their hair was really long, their hair was cut off. And so these women were witnessing that too. I mean, they just weren't like saying to themselves and amongst themselves, hey, we got to show our patriotism towards this nation. I mean, even their organizing was a response to what they were witnessing in their barrio. Next. I was put in a segregated classroom when I entered elementary school. It was called 1C. Maybe it's time that I read a little story and break it up so that you don't have to hear me talking so much and just read something. Because I think that I know that Vicki Reese has done some work. Historian Vicki Reese has done some work around Americanization, but I think that it's been under-researched in the Southwest. I think that we're familiar with Native Americans. Not familiar. There's still much more work to do regarding Native Americans and boarding schools. But I found an instance here in Tucson where there was a training school for established by the Methodists, and they established the Industrial School for Mexican Girls, and it was located near the U of A. And under the guise of improvement and reform, those invested in Americanization programs considered Mexican culture and all its attributes as expendable and something to be purged. I have a picture, and I don't have it on the slide, of these young women who were sent and somehow stayed at the Industrial School for Mexican Girls, which is a rare episode into Americanization of Mexican Americans. So I hope that you can see at the bottom where it says Nona Rhodey. She is the supervisor of Americanization. Now, that should just send a red flag. I mean, our school district had its own Americanization program. And I think it's true in other places. I was put in an Americanization program as late as 1961. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. Maybe go to the next slide, Sarah. So this is my first grade teacher. I had no problem, absolutely no problem finding things, information about my first grade teacher. All of the names in my book are actual names. I use pseudonyms only for two people, and that's my sixth grade girlfriend and my high school girlfriend, because I don't want to out them, and I don't know what their great-grandchildren will have to say about that. But everybody else in the book, I use their names. So my first grade teacher actually started life with a lot of optimism and certainly had a lot more class privilege. So let me just read you what I wrote here. My fellow students and I recognized the stigma of being placed in 1C as we were easily identifiable. The signage on the door to our classroom read, Mrs. Pepworth, and it had grade 1C beneath it. Our class photo also identified us as such. Educational historian Maritza de la Trinidad has explained that the segregationist and assimilationist goals exemplified by 1C as, and I'm quoting her here, by 1950, school practices, programs, and policies and pedagogical aims were to solve the so-called Mexican problem in public schools, which included English-only instruction, a no Spanish rule on the school grounds, segregation, Americanization, and vocal education centered on industrial arts were entrenched and widely supported in school districts across the Southwest, including those in Arizona. And some of those policies and programs continued well into the 1960s. So I turned the lens on myself and say that my language skills were never tested before I arrived at my elementary school in 1961. Administrators and teachers, secure in their racist generalizations, ignored the fact that I was English dominant and did not speak much Spanish. The same was true of all of the other students in Mrs. Pepworth's class. Instead, they made their decision to place us in 1C based on the color of our skin. They also assumed that I and those like me needed remedial English and Americanization because we lived on the wrong side of town and were therefore inherently deficient in language and culture. And this is something too that the research into local communities will reveal, that after the Board v. Brown decision that happened, I think in 1856, that school districts found other ways to segregate, right? And here in Tucson, they they segregated because we supposedly did not speak English, and we were holding back the English speakers in the other in the classes, which was totally a fallacy. Next. Just to contextualize and say that actually striking children with rulers, and which I witnessed Mrs. Pepworth do often, was legal. Up to 1973, it's still condoned, and it's still, the school district doesn't take a position against it. So just want to share that. Next. And this is a newspaper article from 1972. And Mrs. Pepworth is long gone. She's moved up to the Northwest, and but she's going on religious tours, and she's talking about her experience of teaching English to Mexican-speaking children. So it's interesting to see how she never saw what she did as wrong. I mean, she made it seem into something heroic, a heroic time of her life, which for me was actually, I don't know, made me angry. Next. And this is when I went back to my elementary school to try to find documents and to try to find evidence or anything I could find around 1C. This is the class, the 1C class that I walked into often. This is a picture of me at that time. It turns out that my elementary school did not have any documents about 1C and about me. So then they sent me to my high school, which my high school had a little ID card. And then I went to the school district. I talked to, I waited, I gave them my email. They actually contacted me. I went back, and the school district could not find any documents relating to 1C. I know it sounds hard to believe, but I have the emails, and an attorney even got involved, but I could not recover any documents regarding 1C. That's why it's important for these either oral interviews or memoirs to chronicle these periods of time, because there's always this mystery fire that destroys documents, or somehow they got misplaced, and we need to leave a historical record of our lives back then, and of the challenges that we had to face. Next. And of course, this is about homosexuality in my book. I try to situate what it was like at that time. And these are two headlines that I decided to include. Of course, things are different now, but it's important to know what was happening in Tucson that we now recognize as pretty liberal, right? Next. And I had to wear dresses in school up until 1971, a junior in high school. Up to that point, being queer, non-binary, it was really hard. I wanted to wear pants, but the school district would not allow me to wear pants. Just a question for Sarah. Oh, there I see the time. Okay, we're doing okay. And actually, even including photos of me in dresses, I felt uncomfortable, but I had to include them in this memoir so that you could see the contrast. Next. So here's me on one of my birthday parties with my piñata. And this is a photo later of how I would prefer to dress, and probably dressed most of the time. It was very, so I'll read a section about my mother. In this book, it was really hard to write about my mother. I mean, I wanted to I didn't want to cut her a break, but at the same time, I wanted to portray our relationship in a more realistic way. And let me see. I did mark it. Oh, here it is. I was the youngest of 6 children that Chita raised, and I was the only one that challenged assigned gender expectations. My mother kept a close eye on me, and I often noted a pondering look on her face. I observed her watching me once as I practiced cowboy tricks for hours with the toy gun that my tia Mercy had gifted me. I was 7 then. I kept my eye on my mother too. Did she really think she could stop me from being different? Maybe she wished just as hard as I did for a remedy, but I am sure we wished for different outcomes. Since I fell out of place in the girl role, I often felt like I disappointed my mother. I picked up on her embarrassment when she was asked by distant family members why I did not wear dresses, why I did not comb my hair, or why I did not look like a girl. She would often respond that I was a tomboy or that I was going through a phase. I internalized what I sensed as humiliation, and I compensated by trying to persuade myself that I was superior to others and from somewhere else. Taking this position made me feel less vulnerable to judgment, and it also allowed me to distance myself from societal expectations. Also, when I was around 7, a friend of the family came to our house and asked, "So you're Lily," and that was my family nickname. "You've grown so much. Are you a boy or a girl?" I replied, "I'm adopted." Not being able to fight for my right to be who I was, I retreated into an imaginary world. Enthralled by President John F. Kennedy, I began to weave a story where he had a brown child and sent it away. In my child's mind, the possibility of change became my ally, and I awaited the morning when things would be righted and I would wake up a boy. Until that happened, I waited for a member of the Kennedy family to knock on the door of our house on Farmington Road to claim me. And that adoption narrative is kind of silly, I know, but it was very real. I also think it adds to the historiography of Latinx studies because there are books on Viva Kennedy and how Mexican and Mexican Americans love the Kennedys. They were Catholic, but I've never encountered a story about a child being attached to the Kennedys and how they saw this first family and so of course he gets shot in 1963 and it's very traumatizing for me as a child, and I write about that too, and even those of you my age and older, you know exactly where you were when Kennedy was assassinated, or you know exactly where you were when you heard the news. And I think that recovering those stories, I think, is really important on a personal way because it affected all of us. Next. And this is my queer elder. Like all families, there's always been queers in our families, whether we wanted to recognize them or not. This is my cousin Connie, who was very much a queer in our family and who was my role model. Next. And this is a high school friend that I'm thinking of writing. He's in my last chapter. I'm thinking of writing a nonfiction book based on him in the future, a nonfiction, like a fictional history of, he's the valedictorian of my high school, and he goes on to Stanford, and he dies of HIV/AIDS in 1986. So I'm thinking after this next book that I'll write about Juan. Next. I just want to show you these pictures because I want to show you joy. Not everything was miserable. In my childhood, there was a lot of fun times. I had a lot of cousins. We had fun. We had parties where we celebrated ourselves. Some of these photos are in the book. Certainly these, I talk about this as much as I can because I want the celebrations to be part of the story, the bonds built between us to be part of the story and to be remembered. I certainly want to see my family memorialized in this book, but I also don't want to see them at terrible things happen, but also there was a lot of joy. Next. You can tell from these photographs, I tried to put a collage of more brown people having fun. Next. Always parties, always birthdays, always saint days, always these gatherings that brought us together. Next. And so I was very proud that this book won an award from my local library that I used to go to as a child. Won a Southwest Book Award, which was cool. I'm very proud of that. Next. And my other work before In the Shadows was La Calle, where I chronicled the destruction of the Mexican American downtown that we called La Calle. It was small retail. And it kind of fits in with the theme of the AARP around livable cities. And if you looked at the ingredients that made up La Calle, you would see that it was very sustainable and very much what we aim for today. Next. Of course, and so you can see there was a lot of Sonoran row houses built out of adobe. So maybe I said this, but it was 80 acres that was destroyed and over 260 structures that were leveled to make room for a Tucson Convention Center here in Tucson in the late 1960s. The impressions that Tucson was too Mexican downtown, to displace Mexican Americans and move them to other places away from the downtown area was one of the underlying motivations. Next. This is what resulted in terms of removing those homes. Next. And here you see a photograph of what is now the Tucson Convention Center. You can see that most of what was raised was to make room for parking and for cars. The idea of multi-story parking hadn't arrived yet, or if it had, it was not implemented. But the people who lived in La Calle walked everywhere. I mean, downtown was close by. They didn't need cars, so they walked everywhere. They also knew everybody, so it was this network of people that were there and formed a support system. I hope that if I had more time, I'd tell you about how they were more sustainable and they collected water, they had gardens, they had chickens. Next. And so bringing us, let's next go to the next one. So bringing us now to 2023, and in the last couple years, it's become more heated. These are the reasons that La Calle was torn down. I mean, you see these ethnocentric attitudes toward an adobe house. With me, you could probably see the stench, how it was considered less than the modern building, which has rays coming out of it. But at the same time that this judgment is being transferred onto the structure, you can see that cultural appropriation is taking place by those of the dominant culture, right? You can see by their attire. Yeah, there's cultural appropriation going on, but a lot of judgment toward adobe homes. Well, a lot has changed in these last 50 years regarding adobe homes. Portions of La Calle that were not destroyed are now the most expensive real estate in Tucson, Arizona. Next. This is what what remains looks like now. It's very beautiful. It's very much like what the entire, if the La Calle hadn't been destroyed, what it could have become, right? What we would have still had. And it's a great tourist attraction, but nobody can afford to live there anymore. In fact, I read a story, but I'm not going to read it because of the time. But next. This is my mother's rental receipt from 1940 of a house she lived in. And that still stands. Next. And this is the house. And actually met the woman and I went inside. And I had a lot of feelings, and I write about it in the book, that my mother could live there in the 1940s, and she had the salary of a so-called maid, whereas I, in 2019, was a professor and couldn't afford to live there. So some of the disparities that taken place in this neighborhood, which has made the oldest barrio in Tucson just inaccessible or just impossible for ordinary people to live there. Yeah. Next. And so this is an example of housing. Can't really tell because of but it's just going for a lot of money, and and people are paying to live in Adobe that was stigmatized, but now Adobe's cool. Next. So that graphic that I showed you, I redrew it so it would reflect current times, and it looks like this. Next. And this is the reality, right? Brown people displaced from their own barrio. Next. I'm going to end my talk here. I assume most of you are from San Antonio. My books are not in the bookstores there, but they are at Barnes & Noble online and on Amazon online. So maybe you can pick them up there. And I'm going to end my talk here because I see that we have 10 more minutes. Sarah, is that right?
We can go a little bit over, I think. That's the beauty of these virtual talks. It's not like they're going to kick us out of the space.
Right.
But thank you so much, Lydia. I just have to say, I have learned so much from you, not only from your books, but I just was fortunate some years ago to meet you in person in Tucson with a group of other colleagues, and you drove us around and showed us these things. Yeah. And that trip was the very first time I had ever been to Tucson. And yet what you were telling us resonated to me as a Texan. I just think the story that you tell about Tucson is a story that people in other Southwest cities can identify with, and probably even just urban cities in general. Right. But I was wondering if maybe before we wrap up, you could maybe just speak a little bit about the history of Mexicanos in Tucson, just broadly. That's a whole other topic, but
sure. Yeah. So Tucson has always been Mexican, right? And when it was established, it was in the state of Sonora, and it was part of Mexico. And there's a very direct connection to Sonora and Sonoran culture. Even when I was in high school, the border was we knew it was there, but crossing the border was not an event as it is now. And so it was a lot of cultural exchange, inter-exchanges across the border. And now it's become very defined. I think Tucson became part of the United States with the Gadsden Purchase in 1856. And so it was late. But Mexican troops didn't leave Tucson until 1856. That date is important because that makes Tucson the most Mexican place in what is the United States, and that Mexican troops were here that late. So that's a special designation.
Yeah. And then the other thing I definitely want to emphasize to folks who are watching and maybe thinking you want to learn more about this. La Calle is a fantastic book published by an academic press and tells you this whole story of what happened to Tucson under urban renewal. But what I wanted you to come today to talk to us about your memoir, because to me, your memoir is such a I love the way you interweave basically the history of this city with the history of your family, and really make real the impact of urban renewal on lives.
Right.
You shared in today's presentation what happened to your grandfather, but
Hmm.
in your book, you talk about many other people
Right.
whose lives were impacted. And so I want to encourage you to read this book. It's you'll get so into it, you will just fly through it. Um, but I do also want to warn you, there's some very heavy moments in this book.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
That's why I try to infuse my presentation with light moments, with laughter and fun, because it was there too, right? And sometimes we get the stories are very heavy when we tell them, and um, but we
yeah,
also forget the connectors, right? What connected us as family and as a people. Yeah.
yeah. Now, your book ends around your school
73,
years.
Sarah. Were you
Yeah,
born in 73? I don't think you were. Yeah.
not yet, not yet. But
Yeah.
you have a sequel coming out,
Hmm.
and so be on the, I want to just ask everybody to be on the lookout for when the sequel comes out. We will certainly figure
Right.
out how to have you back. I think we'll actually probably collaborate with some other friends in San Antonio to bring you to San Antonio.
Oh, great.
But
Great.
it's going to cover your LA years when you moved
Yes.
to LA.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're
So
looking forward.
it's going to be titled LA Interchanges, Brown and Queer Archival Memoir. And it's going to be written in the same style as this is. There's less about displacement, but it is a reconfiguration of LA. In many ways, because I left Tucson and I ended up becoming an electrician in construction. I was part of IBW Local 11 in LA, and I built some of the iconic buildings there. My fingerprints are all over LA. So I want to combine my queer activism, my being an electrician, my love for disco, all of this into this memoir that I should be completed by the end of the summer.
I can't wait to read it. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Otero. It was a pleasure
Thank,
to have you with
thank
us
you.
tonight. Always so good to see you.
The same
I want
here.
to I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Of course, I want to thank AARP for sponsoring tonight's talk, as well as all of our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, and the Mellon Foundation, and individual donors like you. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. We regularly host talks like this, and you can find our schedule of events on our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on social media. You can get those links there. So thank you again, Dr. Lydia Otero,
All
and
right. Thank
we hope
you.
to see you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.